Hi students and followers. Today we are going to talk about scheduling techniques. The techniques which I will be talking about are GANNT schedule technique, milestone technique, program evaluation review techniques, or PERT. But before I actually start by presenting each of these three techniques, I will talk about some advantages by using scheduling techniques. Scheduling techniques create a basis for planning, predicting, and support the use of resources. It also provides visibility and control. It will support managers to evaluate alternatives in terms of time delays, but also provide a base for obtaining facts for decision making. It will also provide a base for reporting of information, reveal independencies of activities, facilities what-if exercises, and finally, aid in scheduling risk analysis. So starting with the first technique, the GANT schedule. The GANT schedule presents events and activities in relation to duration time presented as bars, as it is seen in this figure. The two other techniques which I will be presenting today is the milestone and PERT schedule techniques. Both these techniques are networks techniques, and they are based on the critical path method, or CPM methods, which include 5 different components: events, activities, duration, effort, and the critical path, which is the longest path through the network, and that will determine the duration for the whole project. Keep that in mind. So let's look on a very simple example of CPM method. Here we have two events, number 6 and number 12, with a duration of 6 weeks, which in this case actually will be the critical path. Using the critical path method also implies that we sometimes need to consider that several activities or events must actually be conducted prior to another one. This ends up in a sync. On the other hand, one event might actually be dependent or depend on the dependent relationship with 3 other events, which create burst points. So again, let's have a look on an example of a milestone schedule using the critical path method. Here again, we have the events on the left, and we have the time. And in between, we have just put out and presented the different activities or events in relation to each other, with arrows symbolizing the duration time. If we continue looking on the PERT scheduling technique, we have to know about the 2 key concepts: forward pass and backward pass. When we're talking about the forward pass, the forward part runs from project start to project finish. And if we look on the backward part, we're actually considering customer requirements. When the customer actually requires that the project must be finished, to the starting point of the project. This figure here basically shows a PERT schedule for a project containing 5 different events between start event and finish events. So let's look on the critical path, just counting the time needed for finishing each of these 5 events. So if we just, for example, start by combining the time for event 1 with the time needed for event 2, okay, that will end up in 6 months. If we combine the time needed for event 3 with the time needed for event 4 and 5, that will end up also in 6 months. But if we combine the time needed for event 1 with the time needed for event 5 and join that into the event finish, we will see that that will actually lead into 7 months in total, which in this case will be the critical path. The reason why it's so important to address the critical part is that we need to calculate something called the slack time, which is the difference between the scheduled time for completion and the required time to meet the critical path in a project. So this implies that we have to focus on all events, i.e. in this case, events 2, 3, and 4, and evaluate the critical part, the slack time linked to the critical path. So we have the slack time formula, the T earliest, i.e. the earliest time an event can be finished, and then we have the latest time for completion of events. T earliest time an event can be expected to take place, and latest an event can take place without extending the time for completion, in this case, i.e. the critical path. So taking this into consideration, we will actually see that event 1 can earliest start in the beginning of month 1. And it can also be earliest finished by the end of month 5, since it has a duration time of 5 months. Then we'll focus on event 2. It can earliest start in the beginning of month 6, i.e. 5 plus 1. But it can also be earliest finished by the end of month 6, right? If we look on event 3, event 3 can earliest start when the project starts, and it can earliest be finished by in the end of month 1. And finally, event number 4, that can earliest start in the beginning of month 2, and earliest be finished in the end of month 4, i.e. 1 month plus 3. So putting these into a figure, at first, of course, we can just put out the slack time along the critical path events. Then if we continue, we will just address that the slack time in this case here was 1 month for event 2. Earliest finished month 6, latest finished end of month 7. And if we put into the figures for event 3 and 4 in a similar way, we will see that the slack is 1 month for event 3, just as for event 4. Using the same approach, but taking the customer perspective into account, will actually reveal the backward path of these projects, which will show that event 5 must start in the beginning of week 6 in order to finish by the end of week 7. And event 5 can start until event 1 and 4 are finished by the end of week 7. Event 4 must start in the beginning of week 3, just as event 3 must be finished before work on event 4 start, i.e. by the end of week 2, and event 3 must start by the end of that week. Event 2 must start by the beginning of week 7, and event 2 cannot start until event 1 is finished, i.e. by the end of week 6. And finally, event 1 must start by the end of week 5 to start event 5 at the beginning of week 6. But to start event 2 at the beginning of week 7, event 1 must be finished by the end of week 6. Which actually implies that if we finish event 1 by the end of week 5, that will actually satisfy all customer requirements. So by saying this, I will say thanks for listening again, and have a good day. Bye.